I remember the day Owen moved in with us like it happened this morning. There was a cold, bitter wind outside as my wife, Clarissa, ushered him through our front door. She told me his recovery wouldn't take longer than a month or two, but I braced myself for a longer stint the moment I saw him hobble in on crutches. Owen had always been that sort of man who liked to test the patience of everyone around him, and I never could stand his smug behavior. We'd known each other for years, circling the same social events because of Clarissa's friend group. He was the loudest in the room, always had to be the star. Everything about him rubbed me the wrong way. Truth be told, I never wanted him in our house. But Clarissa insisted, tears welling in her eyes, claiming we had enough space and that family, albeit distant, should look after each other. Owen wasn't technically family, but he had grown up next door to Clarissa's cousins and had become practically a fixture in her extended circle. My reluctance only grew after he set his single bag in our guest room and immediately started bossing me around about how he liked his coffee. I resolved to show patience, reminding myself that I'd promised Clarissa we'd help him get back on his feet. At the time, I had no idea how a short-term favor would morph into a nightmare that threatened to break my entire world apart. As the weeks rolled by, I found myself aggravated by Owen's lingering presence. He was no jobless vagrant, he had a steady position in an accounting firm, but the accident had left him temporarily unable to commute. Clarissa, ever the optimist, volunteered our place because we were closer to the city hospital. I tried to be polite, but every morning we'd have some friction. He complained about the cold floors or the eggs not being runny enough. He never once said thank you. On top of that, he had this uncanny ability to charm Clarissa into defending him. He'd spin his complaints in such a way that left me looking like the unreasonable one. I clenched my jaw and quietly waited for his cast to come off. One night, about 4 weeks in, I was drifting off to sleep when Clarissa started talking about the future. She whispered, "I think we should consider having a baby." My heart sped up. We'd been married 7 years, and while the subject of children had surfaced casually, it had never been a pressing issue for us. My job at the warehouse paid decently, but we lived in an expensive area, and Clarissa worked as a dental assistant. We'd always put off kids until we felt more financially stable. But that night, she was so insistent. Her eyes sparkled with possibility as she talked about how having Owen around made her realize she wanted to help someone else, to nurture new life. I, half asleep, just nodded. Time blurred, and Owen's cast was removed a few days after Christmas. I thought that meant he'd move out soon, but he always seemed to find a new excuse to stay. First, it was that he still needed physical therapy. Then he had a shift in job responsibilities that required him to be in town for more frequent doctor visits. Clarissa kept saying we couldn't just throw him out. Every day, my patience eroded a bit more. He'd lounge on our couch, hog the TV, and ask Clarissa to fetch him water or fluff his pillows. I'd come home from work to find them laughing together or poring over old family photos. It felt wrong, like I was stuck outside my own house looking in. One Sunday afternoon, I was working on our car in the driveway when Owen sauntered out, no crutches in sight, and asked if I needed help. His tone dripped with condescension, but I tried to keep my cool. I handed him a wrench, and he fumbled it before making some joke about how not everyone is born to fix engines. I forced a laugh and continued my work. Minutes later, Clarissa appeared. She had that thoughtful, borderline anxious look on her face. She said, "We need to talk," and ushered me to the living room. Owen followed, arms folded, sporting a smug grin that made my stomach churn. I couldn't imagine what was about to come out of her mouth. In the living room, Clarissa's voice trembled slightly as she explained that she and Owen had been discussing my reluctance to have a baby. She said she wanted one sooner rather than later, that she was feeling time slip away, and that we shouldn't wait any longer. I listened, feeling blindsided. I hadn't realized how urgent she felt about this. Then she dropped the real bomb. She wanted Owen to help us. I blinked, failing to comprehend for a moment. She insisted it was purely practical. Some test results for my fertility had suggested a low sperm count. She was certain she wanted to conceive naturally, not involve clinics or procedures. The madness of it all left me momentarily speechless. Anger surged through my veins. I stood up, trembling, and shouted, "Absolutely not!" My voice cracked, but I didn't care. All I knew was that I was not going to let Owen father a child with my wife. Clarissa stared at me like I was an alien. Owen put on a sympathetic face, though there was something in his eyes that hinted at satisfaction. He said, "I understand how you feel, man, but Clarissa's only trying to do what's best for your family." That single sentence nearly made me explode. My family, as far as I was concerned, did not include him. I stormed out of the living room, slamming the front door behind me. My heart pounded in my chest. I spent that night in a haze of disbelief. The next morning, Clarissa barely spoke to me. She sulked around the kitchen, brewing coffee and avoiding eye contact. I wanted to talk, to figure out how we'd gotten here, but every time I tried, she cut me off. Finally, after Owen left for a physical therapy appointment, she confronted me, calling me selfish. She said I was denying her the chance to be a mother just because of my insecurities. Her words stung deep. I reminded her that I wanted children, but I could not fathom raising a child that was biologically Owen's. The betrayal and disrespect felt insurmountable. She refused to see it that way, insisting that biology was secondary to love. Days turned into weeks, and the tension in our house grew impossible to ignore. Owen's presence now felt oppressive. I could see him watching me sometimes with this guarded curiosity, as though he was waiting to see if I'd snap. Clarissa walked around like a ghost, hardly smiling, constantly sighing. Meanwhile, I withdrew into my own world, volunteering for extra shifts at the warehouse just to stay out of the house. My rage simmered under the surface every time I watched Owen share an inside joke with my wife or coax a grin out of her. I started to wonder if this was more than just a plan for a baby. Was there something deeper between them, something that had grown behind my back? One evening, I came home late and found Owen alone in the kitchen, finishing a glass of water. Clarissa had gone to bed early. He leaned against the counter, regarding me with an expression I could only describe as pity. Then he said something I never expected. "I agree with you, you know. This baby idea is messed up." I froze, the tension in the air palpable. He sighed and set the empty glass down. Clarissa's heart is in the right place, but this scenario is just too complicated, especially for you. She thinks it's a simple solution, but I realize it's more than that. I didn't know how to respond. Hearing him validate my feelings was the last thing I anticipated. I wanted to ask him a million questions, but all that came out was a blunt, "So, why do you keep encouraging her?" He shrugged, staring at the floor. At first, I thought maybe it would be an interesting arrangement. I don't have a family of my own, but the more I see how much it tears you apart, the more I realize it's not fair. I told her as much, but she won't listen to me. I stood there, stunned. Could it be that Owen wasn't the villain I'd made him out to be? For a moment, a flicker of sympathy for him sparked, but it was quickly smothered by years of resentment. I simply nodded, then walked away to our bedroom. That night, I confronted Clarissa. I told her I'd spoken to Owen and that he wasn't even on board with this plan anymore. She glared at me, tears in her eyes, and insisted I must have misunderstood. I pressed her, demanding to know why she was so fixated on Owen being the father. Why not a donor bank if we were going to consider alternatives? Her voice broke as she confessed that part of her always felt drawn to him, that maybe deep down, she believed he would be the best candidate to give her a healthy baby. My chest tightened. It was a betrayal on every level. In that moment, I realized this was no mere solution to fertility problems. It was personal. I ended up sleeping on the couch, furious and torn. My mind raced with all the possible scenarios. Did she love him? Was it just lust, some primal attraction she wouldn't admit to? The next morning, I woke to find Clarissa gone. She'd left a note saying she needed space and would be at her sister's. Owen was nowhere to be seen either, which only fueled my paranoid imagination. I considered calling her, but my anger was too raw. Instead, I paced the empty house, remembering all the times I'd tried to make her happy. We'd dreamed about traveling, buying a small summer cottage by the lake, hosting family parties. Now, that life felt like it was crumbling beneath me. 2 days passed in that fog of uncertainty. Finally, Clarissa returned, looking exhausted and puffy-eyed. She said she'd done some thinking and wanted to approach this differently. She apologized for hurting me, for demanding that Owen be the father. I felt a wave of relief, thinking maybe we could salvage our marriage if we found another path. But she still refused to give up on the idea of having a baby soon. I suggested fertility treatments, adoption, anything that didn't involve Owen. We had a tense discussion, but ultimately, she agreed. I felt the tightness in my chest loosen. Perhaps we could move forward, find a new plan that respected us both. That same night, Clarissa told Owen the baby conversation was off the table. In the days that followed, Owen seemed subdued, almost introspective. He no longer made snide remarks about how I grilled the burgers or how I organized the living room. He thanked me if I handed him something and even tried to pay rent. I refused the money, mostly because I wanted him gone, not lingering with an additional excuse to stay. But a strange civility settled between us. I didn't trust it entirely, but for the sake of my marriage, I tried to keep the peace. Clarissa and I began looking into fertility specialists. For the first time in months, I felt like we were on the same team again. I prayed that perhaps we'd weathered the worst of this crisis. One afternoon, I came home early and found the house quiet. Clarissa's car wasn't in the driveway, so I figured she was at work or running errands. I headed to the guest room to see if Owen was around, intending to ask him about any leads on an apartment he might be considering. The door was ajar, and I saw him speaking in hushed tones on his phone. He sounded agitated. I lingered a moment, curiosity getting the better of me. What I heard made my blood run cold. I don't care what Clarissa thinks she wants. I'm not going to be tied down here forever. She can't keep forcing this baby idea on me if I'm not comfortable. I'm not her backup plan. Then he paused and lowered his voice even more. No, trust me, I have a way out. She's too blind to see what's really going on. I backed away, a knot of confusion and anger twisting in my gut. So he'd never truly intended to follow through with Clarissa's plan, or maybe he'd changed his mind and was now trying to escape. Either way, I was done playing nice. I felt like a fool, letting him remain under our roof when he was clearly manipulating the situation for his own ends. I spent the rest of the day trying to calm my rage, reminding myself that Clarissa was the person I needed to talk to. She arrived home late, offering a small wave, but I just pulled her aside and told her we needed to have a serious conversation. My heart thundered as I prepared to expose Owen's deceit. But that very night, something happened that changed the course of everything. Around midnight, I jolted awake to Clarissa screaming in the hallway. I ran out of our bedroom and saw her clutching her arm, tears streaming down her face. Owen stood nearby, looking guilty and shocked. He said, voice quivering, "We were arguing. I tried to stop her from slamming the door." She pulled away and her arm got caught. Clarissa glared at him, fury in her eyes. She spat. "He grabbed me!" I rushed to her side, my protective instincts roaring to life. Her arm was already bruising. She kept accusing him of assault, while he stammered out denials, saying it was an accident. But I knew I'd had enough. I helped Clarissa into the car and drove her to the ER to have her arm checked. The doctor said it wasn't broken, but a sprain was possible. I watched her grimace in pain, seething inside at Owen. This was the final straw, no matter how the story played out. She insisted she didn't want to press charges, but as far as I was concerned, there was no going back. Owen wasn't going to step foot in our home again. By the time we returned, the sun was rising. I marched through the front door, half expecting to find Owen gone, but he was in the living room, pacing like a restless animal. The moment he saw us, he tried to apologize. I told him to pack his things immediately. Clarissa, her eyes red from crying, nodded in agreement. Owen started to protest, but I cut him off with a cold stare. "You have 1 hour to get out, or I'll call the police myself." He slumped, anger etched across his face, but he retreated to the guest room. As Clarissa sank into the sofa, I knelt beside her. I asked her what had happened, but she only sobbed that she'd been a fool, that she'd gotten tangled up in an idea that had gone too far. I ran my hand through her hair, wanting to comfort her, but also feeling betrayed. It would take time to mend the rift, if it was even possible. When Owen left, I thought that would be the end of it. Clarissa and I spent the next week trying to rebuild trust. We sought counseling sessions, addressed our communication issues, and started researching fertility clinics more seriously. We forced ourselves to talk about everything: my insecurities, her need for motherhood, the wedge Owen had driven between us. Little by little, it seemed we were healing. Then, one evening, I returned from work to find Clarissa pale and trembling in the living room, a letter in her hands. It was from Owen's lawyer, claiming that Clarissa had assaulted him first and that he was considering legal action to cover his so-called medical expenses. My blood boiled. I crumpled the letter, feeling a red mist behind my eyes. I immediately called a lawyer friend of mine to see what we could do. He advised us to remain calm and not to contact Owen directly, but I couldn't let it go. That arrogant man had invaded my house, tried to father a child with my wife, and then physically hurt her, yet he had the audacity to spin it against us. Late that night, as Clarissa tried to sleep, I sat in the kitchen seething, imagining how I could make him pay. My mind returned to the moment he was on the phone talking about some way out and how Clarissa was blind. He was clearly plotting something even then. There would be no forgiveness from me, only retribution. Over the next few days, I dug into everything I knew about Owen. I knew he had a shaky financial history, rumors of gambling debts, some questionable dealings. He was always playing big at the poker table during social gatherings. I managed to reach out to a couple of acquaintances who confirmed that Owen owed substantial money to people who didn't appreciate late payments. Fueled by anger, I discreetly contacted one of those individuals and hinted that Owen had recently come into a large sum of insurance money. I also offered them his new address, which I'd gleaned from a text Clarissa had on her phone. It was a risky move, but I was too furious to consider the consequences carefully. A few days later, we got a follow-up letter from Owen's lawyer indicating that the claim was being dropped due to lack of evidence and personal circumstances. I let out a dark chuckle, imagining how the debt collectors might have paid Owen a visit, scaring him away from any costly legal battles. Clarissa seemed relieved, and though she asked how it all went away, I just told her we got lucky. Privately, I smiled at the knowledge that I'd orchestrated a silent revenge. Owen would never see my fingerprints on it, and he'd have no reason to come back into our lives. I felt a cold satisfaction, sure that my plan had forced him to back down. Clarissa and I continued our counseling, forging a shaky path toward reconciliation. We went to fertility clinics, started exploring options like IVF, and tried to put Owen's specter behind us. Our relationship wasn't the same, but we were learning to communicate better, to trust again. Still, in my quiet moments, I held on to the bitterness, the memory of how he had nearly broken us apart. Eventually, one of our fertility cycles took, and Clarissa's test came back positive. The night we found out, we clung to each other, crying tears of relief. I whispered, "He's gone. We made it." And in my heart, I knew I had no regrets. Some betrayals never deserve forgiveness. Sometimes, only revenge will suffice.